It's been years, and I still get chills thinking about it. When I was 10, my family moved into this old Victorian house in a neighborhood that looked like something out of a postcard. Picture perfect lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of quiet that makes you a little uneasy. My dad, a civil engineer with a soft spot for fixer-uppers, was convinced this place was a diamond in the rough. My mom, a stay-at-home artist who painted whimsical landscapes, loved the light pouring in from the big windows. And me? I was just a kid, excited about the biggest bedroom I'd ever had. It was on the second floor, with a window that faced directly onto the side of our neighbor's house. That house was a bit of an anomaly, a stark, gray box that looked like it had been dropped in from another dimension. It was always so silent, no cars in the driveway, no lights on at night, but I didn't think much of it. Things started getting weird a couple of weeks after we moved in. It was a Friday night, and I was trying to fall asleep when I heard it for the first time. A low, rhythmic scraping sound, like someone dragging a heavy box across a wooden floor. It was coming from the neighbor's house, specifically from their attic, which was right next to my bedroom window. I tried to convince myself it was just old house noises settling in, but it was too distinct. I pulled my pillow over my head, but the sound was persistent. Then it changed. The dragging stopped and was replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It was more like the sound of dry leaves rustling or static on an old radio. It was a whisper without a voice, just a texture of sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a language I could understand, just a series of drawn-out, breathy syllables that seemed to ebb and flow with a sinister rhythm. I'm a brave kid, but that night, I was frozen in my bed, clutching my blanket, listening to a symphony of fear playing out just a few feet away. My parents, bless their hearts, were no help at all. The morning after the first night of whispers, I tried to tell them what I heard. My dad, who saw everything through the lens of physics and structural integrity, just chuckled and said it was probably the house settling. Old houses have character, son, he'd say. And that character sometimes comes with some strange groans and creaks. He even went so far as to get out a level and tap on the wall, explaining how the beams expand and contract. My mom was gentler, but just as unhelpful. She told me I probably had an overactive imagination, a gift I inherited from her, and suggested I draw what I heard. So, the whispers and the dragging continued, and with each passing night, they became a macabre soundtrack to my sleep. I stopped bringing it up, realizing they weren't going to believe me. But the sounds were real, a constant, unsettling presence just a few feet from my head. I started to wonder if the people next door were even real, or if the house was just empty. The whole thing started to gnaw at me. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. The whispers would sometimes sound like they were trying to form a word, a single, raspy syllable that would hang in the air before dissolving back into static. It was infuriating. I needed to see what was going on. My first move was to raid my dad's office, a place usually off-limits due to the sheer chaos of blueprints and power tools. I found an old pair of his binoculars buried in a drawer, the kind that were heavy and had a scuffed brown leather case. The lenses were a bit foggy, but they worked. That afternoon, when my parents were out, I crept up to my window, pulled the blinds back just enough to peek through, and pointed the binoculars at the neighbor's house. I focused on the attic window. It was small, grimy, and seemed to stare back at me like a single, unblinking eye. I scanned the darkness behind the glass, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. No person, no furniture, just an empty black void. What I did notice, though, was that the window was always slightly ajar, maybe a half-inch crack at the bottom. It was an odd detail, especially since it was already getting chilly outside, but I filed it away in the back of my mind. A small piece of a much larger, more terrifying puzzle. The next few nights were a blur of sound and sleeplessness, but everything changed with the storm. I remember it was a Tuesday, the kind of weather that made the whole house groan. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against my window, so hard it sounded like pebbles. The thunder wasn't the usual low rumble. It was sharp, cracking, and seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. I was jolted awake by a sound that wasn't the storm. It was a heavy, thudding noise, as if something massive had been dropped. My heart hammered against my ribs, and without thinking, I crept to the window and peered through the pouring rain. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the neighborhood like a strobe light, and in that split second, I saw it. A shadow, tall and gaunt, moving impossibly fast across the attic window. It wasn't a person. It was too thin, its limbs long and spidery, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural grace. It looked like a marionette being controlled by a panicked, invisible hand, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the darkness between thunderclaps. The next morning, the world felt eerily calm, the storm having washed everything clean. The memory of the shadow was still fresh and terrifying, a cold knot in my stomach. I went outside to the backyard to clear my head, my feet squishing in the soggy grass. That's when I saw it. Tucked against the base of the fence that separated our yard from the neighbors was a piece of paper. It wasn't there the day before. It was a thick, almost waxy sheet, and on it was a drawing. Not a cute, childish drawing of a house or a sun. This was a picture of a child, a stick figure, but with a horrifyingly distorted face. The eyes were massive, black voids, and the mouth was a thin, stretched line. The head was tilted slightly, and the figure wasn't just looking forward. It was drawn to look directly at my bedroom window. The dread that hit me was physical, like a punch to the gut. The whispers, the dragging, the shadow, it wasn't some random occurrence. It was personal. It was watching me. The monster wasn't in the attic. It was just using the attic as a stage, a theatrical prop. It had been watching me all along, and now, it had left me a message that I grabbed that piece of paper like it was on fire and ran back inside, my heart doing a frantic drum solo against my ribs. I practically shoved it in my parents' faces, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what it meant. My dad took one look at it, sighed, and said it was probably some neighborhood kids messing around, an initiation prank for the new family. He even pointed out that the distorted face was just a kid's attempt at being edgy. My mom, ever the artist, saw the thick lines in the waxy paper and said it was fascinatingly raw, and that I shouldn't let it bother me. They just couldn't see the terror in it. They couldn't see how the eyes of that drawing were so specifically aimed at my window. I felt so alone, so small. They didn't get it. They saw a prank. I saw a declaration. I saw a threat. I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this wasn't a joke, and that whatever had been in that attic knew exactly who I was and what I did. That night, sleep was out of the question. I pulled the blinds back, gripping the binoculars so hard my knuckles were white. I just stared at that black, gaping attic window, waiting for the shadow to return for some sign of life. But all was silent. Too silent. The usual whispers and dragging noises were gone, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating quiet. I must have been watching for hours when a new sound started. It wasn't loud, and it didn't come from the attic. It came from a different direction, a more intimate one. It was a slow, choked, gurgling sound, almost like someone trying to laugh while underwater. It was faint at first, but it slowly grew louder, and I realized with a gut-wrenching horror that it was coming from right below my window. It wasn't a whisper. It was a taunt. It sounded like a child's laughter, but warped and twisted, a sound that filled me with a deep, primal revulsion. It was the sound of something enjoying my fear, and it was telling me it was no longer in the attic. It was on the ground, and it was closer than ever. That sound, that sickening gurgle laugh, was a physical thing. It wrapped around me and squeezed all the air out of my lungs. It wasn't just a noise in the dark. It was a promise that it was no longer in the attic, no longer a safe distance away. It was right there. Panic took over. I scrambled back from the window, tripping over a pile of comics, and dove under my bed. I pulled the quilt over my head, but it was useless. The sound followed me, seeming to echo from all directions, as if the walls themselves were laughing. The gurgle laugh was a slow, agonizing parody of happiness, a sound that told me whatever was making it was not just a prankster or a random spirit. It was malicious, and it was toying with me. It knew I was hiding. It knew I was terrified. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It had come down from the attic and was now in the yard, right outside my window, and it was watching my reaction. Just as suddenly as it began, the laughing stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for any noise, any sign that it had moved on. Then, a new sound started. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tapping, coming from the glass pane of my window. It was slow and deliberate, not a random branch in the wind. It was like a single, long fingernail tapping on the glass. I held my breath, frozen in place. The tapping continued, an insistent, maddening rhythm. Against my better judgment, I slid out from under the bed and crept back to the window, pulling aside a tiny crack in the blinds. And in the dim moonlight filtering through the gap, I saw it. Not a full figure, but a detail that will haunt me forever. A long, impossibly pale finger with a black, twisted nail was pressing against the glass, right where I had been standing just moments before. It tapped a final time, a sharp click against the pane, and then it slowly, deliberately, scraped down the glass, leaving a sickening trail of condensation that I don't remember what happened after that. I must have blacked out for a second because the next thing I knew, my parents were standing over me, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. The room was bathed in the harsh light of my dad's flashlight. I was screaming, I think, a deep, primal cry that had finally pierced through the layers of skepticism and into their parental instincts. My dad was asking what was wrong, and my mom was trying to hold me, but I was just a shaking, sobbing mess, pointing a trembling finger at the window. Of course, they didn't see anything. The window was shut, and there was no ghostly finger, no trail of condensation. My dad tapped the glass, checked the lock, and tried to convince me I'd had a terrible nightmare. But I knew every terrified fiber of my being knew that what I saw was real. The finger, the tap, the scraping sound. It was all a message, a final, terrifying communication that told me it had seen me, and it was getting ready to make its move. And then, it just stopped. The terror didn't culminate in a final, climactic event. It just vanished. The whispers never came back. The dragging noises were gone. The gurgling laughter and the tapping on the window disappeared as if they had never happened. The house next door went back to being a silent, gray box. No one ever moved in. The lawn grew long, and the attic window remained slightly ajar, an open mouth and a vacant face. I spent the rest of my childhood in that house, but I never felt safe again. I was always on edge, always checking the window, always listening for a sound that never came. I still don't know what it was or why it stopped. Maybe it got bored. Maybe it found a new target. The fear didn't end that night. It just changed. It turned into a quiet, constant hum of anxiety that's been with me ever since. And the scariest part of all, I'm still not entirely sure that whatever was watching me from that attic and then from my backyard didn't just move somewhere else. I still have that drawing, a faded, waxy piece of paper that reminds me every day that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that come for you, but the ones that just stop, leaving you forever waiting for them to start again. I'm a regular guy, mid-30s, married to my high school sweetheart, Sarah. We've always dreamed of owning a house with some character, not just some cookie-cutter suburban box. A few years back, we finally found it. An 80-year-old two-story house on a decent plot of land, with a yard that was completely overgrown. It was a fixer-upper, no doubt, but the bones were good, and we were excited for the project. At the time, I was working as a carpenter, so I figured I could handle most of the renovations myself. We spent our weekends tearing down old wallpaper, sanding floors, and dreaming about the life we'd build there. The yard was the last big project on our list. It was a jungle of thorny bushes and weeds, but we saw the potential for a garden, a deck, maybe a fire pit. We were so naive, so full of hope. We had no idea what was waiting for us beneath all that green. The summer we started on the backyard was scorching hot, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer. We were out there every day after work, ripping out roots and hauling away debris. It was tough, back-breaking work, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing the space open up. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had let everything go, so we were finding all sorts of forgotten things: rusty gardening tools, old glass bottles, and a few peculiar ceramic figurines of strange, twisted-looking children. One afternoon, I was pulling up some particularly stubborn ivy in a far corner of the yard when my shovel hit something hard. I thought it was a buried rock, but as I cleared away more dirt, I saw a circle of what looked like rotted wooden planks. They were barely holding together, covered in moss and years of decay. My heart started to pound a little. I knew what it was, even before I fully uncovered it. An old, forgotten well. I called Sarah over, and we stood there, looking down at this gaping black hole in our yard. It felt like a discovery, an odd piece of history from the house, and I remember us joking about how it was a cool, spooky addition to our old home. We had no idea how right we were about the spooky part. The more we thought about it, the more we realized we couldn't just leave it there. It was a serious hazard, especially if we ever had kids running around. So, I decided I'd seal it up. But before I did, I wanted to go down and clean it out, just to see what kind of history was at the bottom. I built a makeshift winch and rigged up a harness, and Sarah, bless her heart, was on the other end, ready to pull me back up. The air down there was heavy and still, smelling of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place, a kind of sweet, metallic scent, almost like old blood. The flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, revealing the rough stone walls slick with moisture. It wasn't very deep, maybe about 20 feet. The bottom was a mess of debris, rusted chains, a few shattered clay pots, and a bucket that looked like it had been there since the house was built. I was just about to signal Sarah to pull me up when I saw it, tucked into a little crevice in the wall. It was a small, brittle book, yellowed with age, its pages curled at the edges that I brought it up, and after a quick wipe down, we could see it was a diary. The cover had a drawing of a stick-figure house with a tiny sun in the corner, obviously done by a child. Inside, the handwriting was shaky and uneven, the ink faded to a pale brown. It was a kid named Thomas who had lived in the house decades ago. Most of the entries were what you'd expect: ate beans for dinner again, my dog is lost, things like that. But then the tone shifted. The last few pages were frantic. He wrote about a shadow man that lived in the well, a thing with no face that wanted to play a game. He said he had to hide in the well to escape it, that it wanted to take him to the world down below. The last entry was just 2 words, scrawled messily across the page: he's here. And that was it. The story just stopped. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. We sealed the well that night, but the image of those 2 words wouldn't leave my mind. The horror wasn't in the words themselves, but in the sudden, abrupt silence that followed. It felt like a final, desperate thought, cut short by an unspeakable event. After we sealed the well, things got weird. It started subtly, almost like we were just imagining it. I'd be working in the yard, and I'd get this intense feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. The house next door was empty, and the street was always quiet. Sarah started having these awful nightmares. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, screaming about a little boy crawling on all 4s in the backyard, his eyes pitch black and his mouth open in a silent scream. She'd say he was trying to climb the well, clawing at the concrete I had poured over it. She'd describe his movements as unnatural, like a spider, his tiny, childlike body contorting in ways that just weren't right. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just the stress of the renovation, that the diary had gotten to her head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a bad dream. The feeling of being watched never went away. It was like a constant weight on my chest, a shadow I couldn't shake. One night, a few weeks after we sealed the well, I was jolted awake by a distinct sound. It was the unmistakable clang of a metal bucket hitting stone, a sound that echoed up from the ground. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I knew exactly where the sound had come from, the well, but that was impossible. I had sealed it with a thick concrete slab and then covered the whole thing with dirt and sod. Nothing could get in or out. I lay there, listening, for what felt like hours, but the house was silent again. The next morning, I went out to the backyard, half expecting to see the concrete cracked open. But it was just as I had left it, a perfect patch of grass, blending in with the rest of the lawn. The air felt colder in that corner of the yard, and I could have sworn I saw a faint circular indentation in the dew-covered grass, right where the well was. It was like something heavy had been sitting there, but then disappeared without a trace. But my mind was a complete mess after that. I tried to convince myself it was some weird coincidence, a residual bit of dirt from the backyard, but the distinct shape of the handprint kept flashing in my mind. The next day, I went to work, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the diary, the handprint, and the chilling emptiness of the well. That evening, as Sarah and I were having dinner, our conversation was stilted and tense. She brought up her nightmares again, the same crawling child, but this time she said he was trying to whisper something to her, something she couldn't understand. I tried to change the subject, telling her it was probably the stress getting to both of us. But I could see the terror in her eyes. I could see she was starting to believe in something I was desperately trying to deny. It was a suffocating feeling, like a third presence at the dinner table, a silent observer we couldn't see. Later that night, the fear became a reality. We were both in bed, the house wrapped in a heavy blanket of darkness and silence. Suddenly, the whole house was filled with the sound of a child's laughter. It wasn't a joyful, innocent sound. It was hollow, echoing, and had a tinny quality to it, like it was coming from a long way away. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah shot up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, and grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding in my throat. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by a single, mournful sob. It was a child's cry, but it was so full of ancient, bottomless sorrow that it didn't sound human. We lay there, frozen in fear, listening to the sound of a weeping child somewhere in our house. We couldn't pinpoint the source, but it felt like it was coming from the floorboards beneath us, from the walls around us, and from the very air we were breathing. It was a sound that seemed to be seeped into the very structure of the house, a memory of pure despair that a couple more weeks of this psychological torment passed, and Sarah and I were barely sleeping. We were pale, hollowed-out versions of ourselves, living in a constant state of dread. The laughter and the crying had become a nightly ritual, a macabre lullaby that filled our home. One day, we decided we couldn't take it anymore. We drove to a small town about an hour away, hoping the distance and the change of scenery would give us a moment of peace. We had lunch at a diner and talked for hours about what we should do. Sell the house. Call someone. We felt like we were going crazy, but we both knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that we weren't just imagining things. It was real. We decided we'd go home, grab a few things, and stay at a hotel for a few nights to clear our heads. Maybe the break would give us a new perspective. We were so desperate for a sense of normalcy, for a moment to just breathe without the feeling of a cold hand on our backs. When we pulled into the driveway that evening, we both noticed it at the same time. The air was different. There was a palpable sense of wrongness, a heavy stillness that was more terrifying than the sounds we'd been hearing. As we walked around to the backyard, my blood ran cold. The sod I had carefully laid over the well was ripped up, the dirt scattered. The heavy concrete slab I had poured over the opening was gone. I stood there, staring at the gaping hole, my mind racing. How? How could anyone have moved that? It was easily 200 pounds, maybe more. We cautiously approached the well, and Sarah let out a strangled gasp. Inside, sitting on the stone ledge where I had found the diary, was the old, rusty bucket from the bottom. It was clean now, scrubbed free of years of grime, and sitting perfectly upright. As I looked closer, I saw something scrawled on the side, a message I could barely make out in the fading light. It was a Latin phrase, written with what looked like rust, "Sinite me exire." My high school Latin wasn't great, but I knew enough. The translation slammed into me like a physical blow. "Let me out." Sarah was in hysterics, her face a mask of terror. I, on the other hand, felt a cold, unnerving calm wash over me. It was like all the fear from the past weeks had solidified into a heavy, unshakable dread. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the winch and the harness, the same one I had used to go down there the first time, and without a word, I started setting it up again. "What are you doing?" Sarah shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "You're not going down there, are you?" I didn't answer. I just secured the harness around my chest, took a deep breath, and started lowering myself into the blackness. The air was even colder this time, and the metallic, sweet smell was stronger, more cloying. It was the smell of old blood mixed with something rotten, something that had been dead for a very, very long time. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, and what I saw at the bottom made me stop breathing. The old bucket was there, just as we had seen it from the top, but it wasn't alone. Strewn around the base were dozens of old, rusted objects, toys, mostly. A little wooden horse with a missing leg, a tin soldier with its head caved in, a few marbles scattered on the dirt floor. But it was the other thing that made my blood run cold. Lying next to the bucket, half buried in the mud, was the brittle, yellowed diary. It was open, and the pages were no longer empty. The last entry, the one that had said "he's here," had been crossed out, and a new message was scrawled underneath in what looked like rusty, dried blood. It was the same Latin phrase, sine me exire. Below it, in the same crude, childlike hand, was a drawing of a stick figure with a huge, gaping mouth, holding a smaller, terrified stick figure by the hand. The smaller stick figure had a face full of fear. That was the turning point. Seeing the diary there, open, with the new message and the drawing, it wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a threat. I scrambled out of the well as fast as I could. The image of that drawing burned into my mind. I didn't even stop to help Sarah with the winch. I just ran into the house and started searching, frantically, for something, anything, that could help me. My mind went back to the little ceramic figurines we'd found in the yard, the strange, twisted children. We had thrown them in an old box in the basement. I ran down the stairs, tore open the box, and there they were, all four of them, each one a different, grotesque little figure. They were made of a strange, dark clay, with exaggerated features and hollow, empty eyes. As I held them, I realized they were cold to the touch, colder than anything else in the room. They felt ancient, like they had been sleeping for a very long time. I ran back outside, clutching the figurines in my hand. Sarah was standing there, staring into the well, her body shaking with silent sobs. I didn't have a plan. I just had a feeling, a gut instinct that these things, these strange little toys, were connected to whatever was happening. I looked at the well, at the gaping black hole where the concrete used to be, and I felt a sudden jolt of clarity. I knew what I had to do. I started chanting the Latin phrase from the bucket, over and over, my voice trembling, but my resolve steel-like. Sine me exire. Sine me exire. With each chant, I dropped one of the figurines into the well, listening to the small, hollow plunks as they hit the bottom. The air grew colder, and a strange, mournful wail echoed up from the depths, a sound so full of pain and rage that it made my teeth ache. The wailing stopped as soon as the last figurine dropped. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a stalker. It was the empty, hollow silence of a graveyard. Sarah and I just stood there, breathing heavily, our eyes locked on the black hole. The feeling of being watched was gone. The coldness was gone. The air felt normal again, warm and still. It was over. I don't know how I knew, but I did. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then, without a word, we went inside. The next day, I called a contractor, a guy who didn't ask a lot of questions. I told him there was an old well in the backyard that needed to be filled with concrete, and I didn't care what it cost. He came out that same day with a crew and a big mixer truck. They filled the well with concrete, layer by layer, until it was nothing more than a solid, impenetrable slab that we never talked about it again. Not really. We sold the house a few months later for a much lower price than we had hoped. We didn't care. We just wanted out. We found a small, modern house in a new neighborhood with a perfectly manicured lawn and no backyard mysteries. We had a child a year later, a beautiful little girl with her mother's eyes, and we live a normal, boring life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up with a jolt, a phantom feeling of a small, cold handprint on my pillow. And sometimes, when I hear a sudden, unexplained noise in the house, a little voice in the back of my mind whispers a single, chilling question. Did I let him out, or did I just trap him in? The memory of that desperate drawing, the stick figure with the gaping mouth and the terrified child, is something that I will carry with me forever. I still don't know who or what Thomas was hiding from, or what was in that well. All I know is that I made a choice, a desperate, irrational choice, and I'll never know if it was the right one. This whole thing happened about 3 years ago, right after I finally saved up enough to buy a small house for my daughter, Lily, and me. It was a big deal. At 28, a single mom working 2 jobs, this little house in the suburbs felt like the fresh start we desperately needed. It had a huge backyard, which was the main reason I fell in love with it. Lily was 5 at the time, all pigtails and a contagious giggle, and I pictured her spending her afternoons there, running free. The one strange thing was the house next door. It was completely overgrown. The windows were boarded up, and a massive, old wooden fence separated our yards. I figured it was just abandoned, a neighborhood eyesore, but nothing to worry about. We moved in, and for the first few weeks, it was pure bliss. Lily was ecstatic about her new room and the big yard. and I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I was finally giving her the life she deserved. My routine was simple. I'd get Lily ready for school, go to my morning job, pick her up, and then we'd spend the afternoon together before my evening shift. The backyard quickly became our favorite spot. Lily would be out there for hours, creating elaborate games with her toys. I'd watch her from the kitchen window, smiling to myself as I did chores. But after a couple of weeks, I started noticing something different. She was talking, not just to her toys, but to someone. At first, I thought she was being imaginative, but the way she'd stand by the fence, her little hand resting on the weathered wood, and the hushed, serious tone she'd use, felt more real than a game. I'd ask her who she was talking to, and she'd just say, "The tall man." She described him as an incredibly tall, skinny person, and she'd get a mix of awe and a little fear in her eyes. I'd go out and check, but of course, there was never anyone. I'd try to explain there was nobody there, but she'd just shake her head and insist, "He's always watching, Mommy. He wants me to come play." That's when the unease really started. Her happy-go-lucky nature was fading, replaced by a quiet, watchful nervousness I'd never seen before. That unease grew into full-blown dread a few nights later. I woke up to a piercing, terrified scream from Lily. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran to her room. She was sitting bolt upright, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face a mask of pure terror. She kept pointing a trembling finger toward the window, which was pitch black and facing the backyard. "The tall man, Mommy," she whispered. "He's there. He's watching me." I followed her gaze, but there was nothing. The window was dark, reflecting only our own distorted figures. I checked the lock, pulled the curtains tight, and stayed with her until she finally fell back asleep, my mind racing. Was someone actually out there, a creep watching my little girl? Or was this something else entirely? The next day, I was completely on edge. Every little creak in the house made me jump. In the afternoon, trying to shake off the bad vibes, I suggested we go out to the backyard. Lily was hesitant at first, but I coaxed her out. We were out there for maybe 10 minutes when I heard a low, rhythmic scratching sound coming from behind the fence. It wasn't a branch scraping wood. This was different, deliberate, like a fingernail dragging slowly down a blackboard. The noise was coming from the exact spot where Lily usually stood. I walked slowly toward the fence and got closer, and the scratching stopped. There was a small, knot-sized hole in the wood. Against every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, I put my eye to it, and that's when I saw it. A tall, impossibly thin figure was standing on the other side. Its back was to me, but the sheer height of it was unnatural. It just stood there, motionless, perfectly still. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of this elongated shape, black against the tangled overgrowth. A terrifying silence hung in the air. My blood ran cold, and the rational part of my brain just completely shut down. I pulled away from the fence, my entire body screaming. It was real. The tall man was real. That I scrambled back toward the house, my legs feeling like lead. I grabbed Lily's hand and, half carrying her, went inside and locked the door. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I just held her tight, feeling the small comfort of her warmth against the icy terror that had taken over my body. The rest of the day was a blur of me trying to keep it together while Lily played quietly. I kept glancing at the backyard, but everything looked normal. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows. It was a thin veneer of normalcy hiding a predatory presence just beyond our fence. That night, I made sure every window was locked, every curtain drawn. I even moved Lily's bed into the center of her room. I told myself it was just a strange person, a weird loner, but my gut told me this was a slow, deliberate kind of evil. That my sleep was a patchwork of anxiety and quick, shallow naps. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight, but I was jolted awake by the sound of scratching again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house, from the walls. It was a light, skittering sound at first, but then it grew louder, more intentional, like long, thin fingers dragging across drywall. The sound was coming from the wall in the living room, a completely interior wall with no windows. I shot out of bed, my heart a terrified bird in my chest, and pressed my ear against the cool plaster. The scratching stopped. Then, a few seconds later, it started again, this time from the hallway, just outside Lily's room. A low, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping, like a branch on a window pane, but there were no windows there. I froze, a primal terror seizing me. This wasn't a person. Whatever I had seen behind the fence had found its way inside. It was here, in our house, in our sanctuary. My entire body went cold. I had to get to Lily. I tiptoed down the hallway, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Each floorboard creaked in protest, and I winced, trying to be as silent as possible. The tapping had stopped, and the silence was even more terrifying than the sound. I reached Lily's door, which was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out from her nightlight. I pushed the door open slowly, my eyes scanning the room. Lily was asleep, a peaceful, perfect little angel in the center of her bed. I let out a shaky sigh of relief, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. A faint, spindly shadow on the wall behind her bed. It wasn't the shadow of her bed or her stuffed animals. It was a long, thin, distorted thing, stretching up toward the ceiling. My blood ran cold again. It was the silhouette of something tall, standing just outside the light's reach. My eyes followed the shadow's length, and at the very top, where the head of the shadow should have been, there were two little bumps, like antennae. The same bumps I'd seen on the tops of the tall man's head when I'd caught a glimpse of him behind the fence. He wasn't just a silhouette, he was a defined entity. I backed away slowly, found the light switch, and with a click, the room was flooded with light. The shadow was gone. Everything was normal, but the cold, heavy feeling in the room remained. I backed out of her room, my body numb with a cold terror that went deeper than anything I'd ever felt. I closed her door with a gentle click, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the hallway. I went back to my own room and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I couldn't call the police. They'd think I was crazy, and I'd risk getting Lily taken away. I was on my own. I looked at the clock, the red digital numbers glowing like a warning. 3:13 a.m. The house felt like a cage, and I knew the tall man was the one rattling the bars. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep a wink, just sat there in the dark, listening to every single creak and groan of the house. I kept telling myself it was a hallucination, but then I'd remember the scratching, the sound of something real moving inside my walls, and all rational thought would crumble. As the first rays of dawn finally broke through the curtains, a weak, pale light, I felt a desperate kind of relief. But the dread hadn't left. It was still there, a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. The thing wasn't going to leave. It was in the house. The following day was a haze of desperate attempts to act normal. After dropping Lily off at school, I drove to the local library and went straight to the paranormal section. I needed to find a name for it, a history, something that would give me a weapon to fight back with. I spent hours there, poring over books with bizarre titles, looking for anything that resembled what I had seen and heard. I read about shadow people, about entities that feed on fear, about tall, gaunt figures that haunt places and people. Nothing was an exact match, but the themes were all the same. An unsettling presence, a slow encroachment, a parasitic attachment to a specific place. I left the library feeling more afraid than ever, but with a strange sense of purpose that I went home and started my own investigation. I walked around the house, listening for that same cold dread. It was strongest in Lily's room and along the hallway wall. I took a screwdriver and, with trembling hands, I unscrewed a power outlet cover on the wall where I'd heard the tapping. I peered into the dark cavity, my heart pounding. The space inside was black, filled with insulation and wires. But then I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a horrifying certainty that pierced my soul. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the inside of the drywall. A long, thin, smudged streak that ran from the floor to the ceiling. It was as if something tall and impossibly thin had been dragged up and down the inside of the wall. My hand flew to my mouth. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it had been moving up and down the inside of my walls. Watching my daughter sleep, I was staring at that smudge when I heard the front door open. It was Lily, home early from school. A wave of pure panic washed over me. I slammed the outlet cover back on and rushed to meet her, forcing a smile onto my face. The house suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb. I hugged her tighter than usual, my body trembling slightly. She looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked, "Mommy, can we play outside?" I told her no, my voice cracking a little. She just gave me that knowing look again. "The tall man is inside now, isn't he?" she said, her voice a quiet, flat statement of fact. My breath hitched. It was a terrifying acknowledgement that what I was seeing and hearing was real. My daughter had known all along, and I, in my desperate need for normalcy, had been willfully blind. For the rest of the day, I didn't let her out of my sight. We stayed huddled together in the living room, surrounded by the silence that now felt so menacing. I felt a cold anger building inside me. This thing had invaded our home. It had terrorized my child. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I was furious. In the evening, after I had tucked Lily into bed and triple-checked every lock, I went back to the living room. I remembered a vague passage from one of the library books about using salt and certain symbols to create a boundary. It felt ridiculous, but I was out of rational options. With a shaky hand, I poured a thin, unbroken line of salt across every windowsill and doorway. As I did it, I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the pressure was finally easing, just a little. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't helpless. I could fight. After Lily was asleep and the salt was down, I went back to the living room and collapsed on the couch. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was being woken up by a rhythmic, almost metallic clicking sound coming from the corner of the room, near the old grandfather clock that I had inherited with the house. The clock had been broken since we moved in. It didn't even have hands. But the clicking was coming from inside it, like someone was methodically twisting a wind-up key. Click, click, click. I stared at the clock, a dark, hulking presence in the corner. The sound was so deliberate, so personal. It felt like a message, a challenge. It was telling me my little salt line was a joke, that I had had enough. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, searing rage. I wasn't going to let this thing drive me and my daughter out of our home. I got up, walked straight to the clock, and with a guttural yell, I pulled it away from the wall. The clicking stopped instantly. I looked at the spot where the clock had been, at the wall behind it. And there it was. Not a smudge this time, but a long, thin, vertical crack in the plaster. A fresh one that hadn't been there yesterday. I put my hand to it, and I could feel a cold draft coming from the crack, a bone-deep cold. It was an entry point. The tall man had found its way in, not through the windows or the doors, but through the very bones of the house itself. It was living in our walls, and it was watching us. It was a predator, and my little girl was its prey. I knew this wasn't going to end until one of us was gone. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a hammer, and went back to the wall. I felt like a mad woman, my hands trembling as I stared at that thin crack, but I knew what I had to do. With a grunt, I swung the hammer and hit the crack with everything I had. The plaster gave way with a satisfying crunch, revealing the dark, hollow space between the studs. The cold draft grew stronger, and with it, a sickly, sweet smell, like old, wet leaves and dead flowers. It was a scent I now associated with the tall man, a physical manifestation of his presence. I peered into the hole, my heart in my throat. I couldn't see anything at first, just the insulation and the wires, but then I saw it. Tucked behind a wire was a small, perfectly preserved bird's nest. Not a normal nest, though. This one was made of long, impossibly thin sticks, woven together with a few strands of what looked like human hair. And inside it, resting on a bed of dry grass, was a single, tiny, perfectly formed porcelain doll's eye. It was looking right at me. I fell backward, my legs giving out from under me, and just scrambled away from the wall, a wave of revulsion and terror washing over me. That I wasn't just a trinket. It was a token, a marker. It had placed that nest and that eye there, inside my wall, as a sign of ownership, a claim on my house and my daughter. He had been watching us all along, gathering pieces of us, observing us from the inside. He wasn't a guest. He was a parasite, and he had burrowed deep into our home. I felt a desperate need to protect my daughter, to rip her away from this place and never look back, but a dark part of me knew it was already too late. He had his eye on us. He had his nest in our walls. He was here, and he wasn't going to let us leave. My mind was a hurricane of terror and a fierce, primal need to protect my daughter. I knew I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I went back to Lily's room. She was still sleeping, her breathing soft and even, and I just stared at her for a long time, trying to memorize the sight of her peaceful face. I knew I had to get her out of there without waking her. There was no way I could explain this to her. I went to her closet, pulled out a suitcase, and with a terrible sense of urgency, began to pack. I gently, so gently, scooped her up from her bed, her small body limp and heavy with sleep. I whispered, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here," my voice shaking. I carried her out to the car, my suitcase bumping against my legs, and put her in her car seat, buckling her in tight. I got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and didn't even look back at the house as I pulled out of the driveway. We drove for hours, the suburban streets giving way to the dark, empty highway. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that every mile between us and that house was a mile of safety, a small victory against the monster in the walls. We kept driving until the sun started to rise, a pale, hopeful orange glow on the horizon, and only then did I finally feel the tension in my body begin to ease. We were safe. The next few weeks were a blur. We stayed in a cheap motel, then with a friend. I was a mess, terrified to be alone, but terrified to tell anyone what had really happened. They all just thought I was going through a nervous breakdown, and honestly, a part of me wished that was the truth. But I couldn't lie to myself. The image of that porcelain doll's eye in the nest still haunted my nightmares. Eventually, I managed to get a small apartment in a different town, a good 2 hours away from that place. I never went back. I couldn't. I paid off the mortgage and let the bank take the house. I had lost everything, but I had saved the most important thing, my daughter. She never talked about the tall man again, but sometimes, when I'm watching her play, I'll see a flicker of that same watchful nervousness in her eyes, and I'll feel that familiar prickle of dread. I don't know what happened to that house, or to the thing that lived in its walls, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the dead of the night, I'll hear a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, and I'll wonder if it's the wind, or if it's the memory of a monster that I can never truly escape.